Buenos días. Good morning. Egunon. As you well know, NATO's next summit will take place in Madrid in a few weeks, on 29 and 30 June 2022. And in the framework of this summit, we have considered in the law faculty that it's a good occasion to organize this conference considering the current situation in Ukraine and the role of this international organization. We have the great honor today to welcome Joaquin Molina, who is Senior Policy Advisor in the Political Affairs and Security Policy Division of NATO in Brussels. He has more than 20 years of experience in international negotiations, peacekeeping, conflict management, and conflict prevention. Joaquin Molina has worked for the Policy Planning Unit in the Office of the Secretary General of NATO, as well as for the Public Diplomacy and Operations Division of the Alliance. In those capacities, he has been engaged in a variety of crises, including Afghanistan, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Iraq, Kosovo, Libya, and piracy off the coast of Somalia. Between 2004 and 2008, Joaquin Molina was involved in the negotiation process regarding the international status of Kosovo, led by Nobel Prize laureate and former President of Finland, Martti Ahtisaari. Prior to joining NATO, he was head of section for human rights and rule of law in the Office of a High Representative in Mostar, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he has also been an executive in residence at the Geneva Center for Security Policy and worked on equity markets and public affairs in London and Milan. Last but not least, Joaquin Molina earned his law degree from Deusto University. He's Deusto alumni. His Erasmus experience was in the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and later he earned a master's degree in International Relations and International Economics from the Paul Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies from the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. He's also a graduate from the LEAD program of the Business School of Stanford University in California. As you can see, we have the great opportunity to know and listen to a real leader with an impressive experience of international diplomacy, who has participated in the front line of the most complex missions we can imagine in the last years. Deusto Law School feels very proud and very honored to have one brilliant alumni, as you, Joaquin, with this excellent international career. Congratulations, and thank you very much for coming to Deusto today, your alma mater. We are willing to listen to your words about NATO and its new strategic concept in light of the Ukrainian crisis. A highly timely topic given the current circumstances after the illegal act of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. Today in the auditorium, we have students of public international law, of the law degree, and students of the double degree in international relations and law. And also there are online more professors and students, because this event is in streaming as well. Thank you very much for coming. And now it's time to give the floor to Professor Felipe Gómez Isa. He is Professor of Public International Law and Vice Dean for International Relations in the Law School. With a broad experience in this field as researcher of the Deusto Institute for Human Rights, and he is also National Director of the European Master in Human Rights and Democratization, organized by 41 European universities in the framework of the Global Campus of Human Rights. Thank you very much, because he has organized this conference in collaboration with NATO. Thank you very much, Joaquin Molina. Thank you very much. Felipe, the floor is yours. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you, first of all, Gemma Tomás, the Dean of the Law School, for this kind words and this kind introduction. Thank you for coming to this interesting event. And of course, thank you, Joaquin, for being with us today. Well, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, is a defensive military international organization that was created in the context of the Cold War in 1949 to face the increasing influence and power of the Soviet Bloc. After the end of the Cold War, NATO entered in a period of lack of definition due to the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was the other military organization created under the leadership of the Soviet Union in 1955. A new scenario of international cooperation between former enemies seemed to emerge, but this period didn't last much. And the Russian Federation, led draconically by President Vladimir Putin, started to suffer from imperial nostalgia and launched some military interventions to follow an expansionist policy and recover its spheres of influence in Europe and beyond. Interventions in Georgia, in Syria, in the Donbas region and Crimea in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Well, in this context, a NATO summit to reflect on its challenges will be held in June 22 in Madrid in some weeks, where a new strategic concept will be developed. The Russian military aggression on Ukraine will obviously condition the discussions on NATO's role in an increasingly troubling world. Well, Joaquin Molina is the right person to shed light on these pressing issues. Joaquin, thank you for coming back to your home. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for these very kind words. I do feel home, and I feel that despite the difference in age with you in the audience, basically I'm one of you, and I will be immensely happy if I could actually trade positions, and I will be one of you, very young, rather than much older person talking to you. Thank you also for the very kind introduction, and I can tell you that thank you very much for your praise on my career. I was not a very good student, so I can tell you there's always hope, and you can have a fantastic professional career. You just have to get and study as much as you can, and once you get out of university, use that knowledge to your advantage, and also your personal skills and things that you learn, not just at university, but from your colleagues as well. So thank you so much. I'm very touched. It's very unusual that I'm touched when I'm speaking, because I'm sort of a very cold person, I think, but I'm very touched. I'm very humbled to speak here at Deusto once again after 30 years. I have been with NATO for over 20 years, and it has changed a lot. This is actually our new headquarters. This is the famous symbol of NATO that we have actually at the very front door. From Biden to the Prime Minister of Spain, that's the first thing they see of NATO when they come for a summit. If the summit takes place there or for a meeting, it's basically like it means a lot to people who work in NATO, because it is actually the embodiment of the values that are behind the organizations, and which I will elaborate about a bit later. As it was said before, what is NATO? NATO is an alliance. It's a political military alliance between Europe and North America, and it's based on values. It has also countries that actually are not part of the usual European framework, but are located in Europe, like Turkey, and which add a lot to our defense and security and collective security. What does NATO do? Well, NATO is about political dialogue. It is an alliance. It is a defensive alliance, and that's very important. It's defensive. It's not offensive, despite the propaganda that a number of countries in the world are actually launching against NATO for a long time now. It is defensive in nature, and it's based on political dialogue, meaning that we have an organization in which the basis is democracy, it is political dialogue, and we also happen to have a very important military machine behind, which means that when we say something, it counts. because when we have a strategy or we have an operation, a military operation, then military operation is implemented. We have the means to do that, and we have the planning capability to do that. Don't forget that NATO is also a massive confidence building exercise. Back in 2019, 2020, I was actually involved in very important negotiations between two NATO allies that had a problem in the Eastern Mediterranean. Tensions were very high, and NATO was the format and the framework for solving those tensions and building that trust that had been momentarily lost. It's a crisis management organization, I would say, that has the highest standard of crisis management in the world. It's actually the standards, the NATO standards, are something that is basically the golden standard of the industry. The United Nations, the European Union, whenever they want to speak about a certain standard, be that military or diplomatic in terms of crisis management, they always refer to NATO. And that's one of the reasons why so many countries, and I will get into that later, it's interesting working with NATO, because you learn a lot by being deployed as a military person, by being a diplomatic member of any of the national delegations that deal with NATO. You deal a lot with crisis, and you learn a lot from the way that we do diplomacy and we do military affairs. It's a capacity building machine, because we trained people, and not just military, also civilians, on aspects of crisis management, of diplomacy, of negotiation. It's actually pretty impressive what my colleagues do back at the headquarters. And it's a machine that adapts. It's an international body that has been adapting, as Felipe was saying before, all throughout its history. Before I get into the history of NATO and before we get into the analysis of the current events, I would like to describe to you the decision-making process in NATO, because this photo that you have here is the North Atlantic Council. That's the heart of NATO. The people that you see sitting around the table are actually ambassadors from NATO countries. We have 30 NATO countries. Think that originally we have 12 when NATO was founded in 1949. And the family may grow if you're following the news. We're not sure yet, but it may grow, as you may know. What is important about NATO is that every single decision that comes out of this North Atlantic Council has to be basically like done there's a rule of consensus. So it has to, every single nation behind that table has to agree. So whenever you hear that NATO is basically a puppet, as it was I read the other day, of the Americans, that's not true. That the Americans are part of NATO and they have a very strong voice within the organization is a fact. It's a blessing, and it's also sometimes difficult to manage for some allies. But at the same time, NATO does not always do what the US decides to do, no? And that there's plenty of evidence of that. I tell you, like every single nation, including Iceland, which has no army, has a veto in NATO. And that's why NATO, as we say, it's a club of democracies, because we don't rely on very serious business of peace and war. We don't rely on a qualified voting. We don't rely on a majority voting. We have to have consensus. And that consensus trickles down. It's not just the North Atlantic Council, it's all the committees that are supporting the work of the North Atlantic Council, including the military committee. So every time you have a NATO decision at whatever level involving nations, all nations in NATO have to agree. And that's something which is rather unique. What does it mean? It means that the decision is very strong. On the negative side, the decision might take a bit longer to be taken, because of course you have to trade off and you have to explain your positions to everyone and convince the other allies that they have to support a certain decision or they have to oppose a certain decision. So the speed of the process has always been one thing in which, when there is a crisis, we have shown that we are pretty quick compared to other international organizations, not to be mentioned here, but it's also a handicap. The important thing is, by having consensus, we have a very strong decision every time we take one. The Secretary General is the head of the administration and is the political figure that you will have seen in NATO photographs, surrounded by the heads of state and government or ministers. And at the moment, it used to be a foreign minister for a long, long time, mostly since the beginning of NATO. But since Rasmussen, it has been a former prime minister. Basically, now we have Mr. Stoltenberg, who used to be the prime minister of Norway, and who will come after, we will go back to a foreign minister or a prime minister, former prime minister, that's still to be seen. For the time being, he's going to stay for 1 more year. Against the background of the crisis in Ukraine, it was decided that he ought to stay. So that's basically the figure that we see, the person that you will see in the Madrid summit, the gentleman that you will see, like together with other heads of state and government. As I explained, the role of committees is to support the people in this photograph, is to actually digest the decisions before they get to that level, which is the highest. And this, the North Atlantic Council, just for you to understand, can meet basically with ambassadors, which is obviously every week in NATO, or can meet also at the level of ministers or heads of state and government. And then we have the military structures that support it, but I'll not bore you with that. I'm going to just go back in time and talk about the history of NATO. This is the photograph of the signature of the NATO treaty in 1949 on the 4th of April. The foundation of NATO is called the Washington Treaty. And it's a very short treaty. It has 14 articles. I don't think there's any kind of similar document that is so short, but it's very clear. And that is very, very important. And I don't know if you know much about the history of the United States, but basically, the US, since the beginning of the Republic, followed the advice of George Washington of not committing itself to any kind of alliance. Only in war, the United States was part of an alliance. The First World War, Second World War. When it came to explain the need to have NATO in 1949, the US Senate had to actually agree on a resolution, the Vandenberg resolution, through which basically the US actually decided to participate in an alliance to defend other countries in peacetime. So when we talk about, when some people talk to you about NATO as a sort of like part of the American empire, and this is not true. As I said, even the US Senate basically put its conditions to be part of NATO. And one of the first conditions they put to the Europeans is basically, you guys have to come together. So basically, like when you have the 12 foundational members of NATO, before they go to NATO, they had to have something called the Brussels Treaty of the Western Union, which is basically a treaty in which the Europeans decided they would defend themselves. And then they went to the Americans to actually join, and the Canadians to actually be part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I don't know if any of you has an interest in cinema, but when you look back at the Cold War, the very beginning of the Cold War, there's a very good film in which Orson Welles actually acts. It's called The Third Man, and it's a very good film about espionage. If you haven't seen it, it's a real masterpiece of cinema. And the reason why I bring it about is because, like you that are so young, who have no physical or personal experience of the Cold War, can see something that myself, who has an experience of the Cold War, never saw, which is Europe destroyed. You have the film happens in Vienna, right after World War II, and you would see basically the landscape is very similar to what you would see in cities like Aleppo or like Grozny at the time, or now unfortunately in Ukraine. It's basically like destroyed cities with no infrastructure, people living in poverty, a lot of scarcity, black markets, military occupation. So that's the Europe that we had right after World War II. It is difficult to imagine when you look around Bilbao, this beautiful city, that Europe was like that not so long ago, but it was. And that's the importance of confidence building, as I said before, in terms of NATO. When you go around Brussels, and if you're interested in military history, you'll not see a single Russian soldier buried in Belgian soil, but you'll find plenty of Canadians, British, American, German, of course, Belgium, you name it, many Europeans and North Americans, but not a single Russian soldier. So that's the importance of NATO, again, in terms of confidence building. It's a machine that has not only defended Europe or North America as well, but has also kept us together. In fact, the first Secretary General of NATO had this say that Russia was meant to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. That was what he said when he got the job, his job for the first time, Secretary General of NATO. As Felipe was saying before, the Cold War was a relatively stable period. It was basically, there were two blocks, and that's difficult to convey in terms of an experience to somebody so young as the people in the audience today. But I mean, we were totally living separate from each other. And I'll get into that when I come to interdependency today and the conflict in Ukraine, or the next SOD concept, or the crisis of COVID and value chains, is that at that time we had two separate worlds. The first time I saw a Russian in my life was in 1994. Or at least that I remember, I saw a Russian. We just left, we had separate lives, totally separate lives. There was the Berlin Wall, and they lived their life. We lived our life. We were suspicious of each other. We spied on each other with everything we had. Malls inside this, the intelligence structures of the Soviet Union, satellites, U-2 planes, whatever we had. And they did the same to us. But we lived totally separate lives. We had wars by proxy. We had wars in the African continent, in Latin America, for example, in Asia as well, Korea, Vietnam. But, like the war never got to Europe. And that was so much the shock of the 1990s with Yugoslavia, with the former Yugoslavia, the wars there, and now with Ukraine. We just got used to peace in Europe. Although peace has to be redefined. And I will talk about the way, basically like the current weaponization of everything that has happened in the recent years. This photograph is of Manfred Dahme, when he came to the Moscow, to a meeting in Moscow with Minister Shevardnadze, who was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, with Gorbachev. And as you say, like it's just basically like everybody was part of that delegation. And my first boss in NATO was part of that delegation, where actually it was like going to Mars. It was like literally going to Mars. They had no clue what there was behind. I mean, my boss in NATO had, because he had been expelled twice as a spy from the Soviet Union. So like he had seen a bit, but not as much as he wanted. And then a very important point that I mentioned here, the system of MAT, mutually assured destruction. It was stable, but it was very dangerous. It was basically like the world that you have read probably in the books, of having like thousands of nuclear weapons designed to actually like destroy the other side. And the logic of that was basically that deterrence was such that if you had, basically you could assure that the enemy will be destroyed if they attacked, so mutually assured destruction, MAT, like crazy in English, that there will be no war. And the system worked. But there was one point in the Cold War in which we almost had nuclear war, and we will talk about that in the context of Ukraine, and that was the 1962 crisis. And for all of you, I mean, those in the law faculty, but also those who are studying international relations or are simply interested in history, which I think is probably the best way to learn about international relations that there is, have a look at the decision-making process in 1962, because we can learn a lot about how things work, but also how you approach a situation in which you can actually escalate towards up to nuclear war, including tactical war, because that's also very important and relevant in terms and in the context of Ukraine today. Then the troubled 1990s that was referred before, you had the fall of the Soviet Union. All of a sudden, the country collapsed. And as we have seen, and I will talk about that later, what happened with the Soviet Union is that, as I said, we didn't see what was happening there, but we had an idea that, or the idea that the Soviet Union was strong, and that the Warsaw Pact was strong, and all of a sudden the whole thing disintegrated. There's a very interesting anecdote of the Soviet ambassador in NATO being part of a meeting, leaving the room and coming back to the meeting and taking the floor, asking to take the floor. And then he took the floor and said, I just need to inform you that my country ceased to exist. There's no longer the Soviet Union. Now we have this, everything that there was has disappeared. So now I have to stop talking. I have to get instructions. So the first Gulf War in Iraq, also very, very important. And I lived that as a student in Deusto, no? The Yugoslavia, that was actually and I speak very personally here, that was actually what made me interested in international relations and what made me eventually want to be part of NATO, no? The fact that the crimes in the former Yugoslavia were happening, and eventually it was American intervention and NATO's intervention with Javier Solana as Secretary General of NATO, which actually stopped the violence there. And as a personal anecdote, and I'm happy to answer questions about that, I was for many years the person that was the interaction between the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and NATO. So I processed all the evidence against Milosevic and Karadzic for the war crimes, which is also relevant later on for the war that we are seeing now in Ukraine. I was also like, it's a time of expansion. We are doing, as Felipe said before, we were talking about like we had a purpose in the Cold War. That purpose disappears because the threat perception totally changes. And then we start doing things like military operations abroad. We start with I4 and S4, which take place in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we moved to K4 in 1999. We basically had never done that. And we became really good at it, despite the very sad end of Afghanistan. But I also have dealt with these operations. If you have particular interest in peacekeeping, so I'll be very delighted to give answers to answer any question you may have about it. And then we had partnerships. We have an exploding universe of partnerships based on mutual interest. So we work with partner countries because we're interested in them being stable, but also because they're interested in working with us. So it's basically a two-way street in terms of political discussion as well as practical work. And then we have the key drivers of partnership: transformation, enlargement, because we are a club which is not closed. We have the open door policy. We're open for anyone who basically meets the criteria to be part of NATO and who wants to transform itself into basically a country that is a net provider, not a net consumer of security, to join us. This is the map was basically that what we do in terms of the interoperability to be able to work together. It sounds like kind of interesting, no, but it's very important. When we come to institutional transformation, I spoke about that briefly before, security cooperation dialogue, that you can perfectly imagine what it is. But interoperability, you cannot take it for granted that if you deploy a military operation in a certain place, someone using a radio will be able to talk to someone using a radio on the same side of the military operation. That's not a given. If you put different military contingents, and that's one of the problems that the United Nations has when it comes to peacekeeping, is that the culture of the contingents is very different and the military capabilities are very different. And sometimes they can just not work together. In NATO, we work together. And for example, in terms of the standards, international humanitarian law that has come under so much attack in Ukraine as it did in Syria before, is actually one of the first things that people get as they are deployed. They get trained in international humanitarian law and they get a card about how to behave with the civilian population to avoid situations in which basically you get involved in a war crime or in an accident or in something which is actually not legal in the international humanitarian law, even without wanting to do it. This is the evolution of partnerships. I think that I'll skip that for the sake of time, but it gives you the idea that how much we have been expanding the partnership universe. And this is the map of partnerships. Basically, we have partners in North America, in North Africa, in the Middle East, all about the countries in the former Soviet Union. Finland and Sweden are partner countries of NATO, Ireland as well. So many of the countries that are part of the European Union are actually part of NATO. 22 of them are part of NATO. And then we also have partnerships around the world. Colombia is a partner of NATO, and actually it's a very, very useful and very active one. We are partners with Japan. We're partners with South Korea. We're partners with Australia, New Zealand, and we have done a lot with these countries. Far as they might be in terms of geography, we're very close in terms of values. And also, far as they might be in terms of geography, the ways of working with these countries very similar, because they use the NATO standards for diplomacy as well as for military affairs as the goal. They develop that way, and that as a result, we're able to work with these countries. And we want to build an even stronger relationship. I'll get into China later because, of course, that's part of it's one of the biggest questions that the next strategic concept has to answer. But actually, like, these countries have a lot to say in the way that China help that they can provide in terms of understanding what China is and how China sees the world, including NATO. This basically, like, today, from 2000 to today, we have, of course, September, the 11th of September. And on the 12th of September, it was the first time this Article 5, which is part of the NATO treaty, which is the one that commits, basically, like, that says that an attack against one of the NATO countries is an attack against all countries. That was the first time and the only time it has been invoked. It's collective defense. Then we have, of course, the operation in Afghanistan. Happy to speak to you about that as well. And then the NATO Lisbon summit, which came with a new strategic concept. I'm going to speak about the strategic concept because it's important here to understand what it is, because in Madrid, we're going to have a new one. So 10 years later or 12 years later, we're going to have a new strategic concept. The strategic concept, if you have the Washington Treaty as the foundation of NATO, the strategic concept is actually the way in which NATO sees the world. And that's why it's so important, because it will inform like an organic law in the Spanish system of framework, constitutional framework, is something that will inspire the rest of the legislation, right? So the strategic concept is the way in which NATO sees the world and the way in which NATO needs or sees that we need to operate. The strategic concept defines 3 core areas for NATO. The first one, and most important for many, is collective defense. Is Article 5, is that defense that NATO provides, that shield that NATO provides to countries which are part of the organization. The second one is cooperative security, is the partnerships that I described. And the third one is crisis management. That is actually a document, and it's a public document. You can actually download it from internet. You can read it. I would advise you, if you have an interest in NATO, that you read it, because actually it's going to change. So when you read the new version in Madrid, you will have seen what has changed. And these are the kind of areas in which the 3 pillars, the core tasks that I referred to before. We have Libya here. It's an operation in which I was also part on the civilian side and the decision-making process as well. We have, again, and now we get into the today. The Crimea 2014, the invasion by the little green men, the hybrid war. 2014, when you come back to Deusto as alumni in many years, you will remember, and if you have worked in international relations, 2014 will be a pivotal year in history in Europe. And not just for Europe. We had the end of Afghanistan, of ISAF. We have basically, it's right after the 2008 financial crisis that has had a huge impact on international relations, beyond anything that people tend to imagine. It has changed the world. 2008, the financial crisis, and it was the year of the invasion of basically like Crimea and part of Ukraine. We had been talking until 2014. We thought that cooperation and all that framework of partnerships that we had, including with Russia, was possible and was actually able to outlive, was able to have a sort of a useful setting, no? But 2014 demonstrated that actually Russia was on a different course and a worrying one. And then you have also the basically like a stronger relation being developed between China and Russia, which is also one of the factors we can discuss later on about that relationship. 2014 was also the beginning of a new NATO which was tilting towards collective defense again, less peacekeeping, less peace support operations, more emphasis on the home front, more emphasis on cyber defense, more emphasis on areas which are actually important for the defense of the 1 billion people that are citizens of NATO countries. And I say 1 billion people because the Chinese, as you know, they're very proud of being 1 billion citizens. And we're also 1 billion citizens, but we're 1 billion free citizens, and that never has to be forgotten. And that's protected by the NATO shield. So that's actually, if you ever have a question why NATO matters, say, well, it's because it provides security for 1 billion people, including me. The Brussels summit in 2021 launched something called the NATO 2030 basically agenda, which has all this list of issues that we can talk about, but I will boil down to 4. Basic one is that we have to be talk to more people, meaning broaden our universe of partner countries as well as international organizations with which we work. We have worked for a long time with the African Union, with the United Nations, with the European Union, have a very strong relationship with them, but we can talk and we must talk to many others, like World Bank, EBRD, you name it. Then the technological edge, we have to be ready to deliver security, and security is, as you will talk, and we'll talk a lot about that in the case of Ukraine, actually something that has become very technological, including cyber defense. It's very technical, and we need to invest a lot of money into being ready for that, including resilience as well. It has an aspect of resilience to make us resilient as a society. And resilience was tested with COVID. I think the COVID stress test was actually very important in terms of how we see ourselves as strong or not strong in terms of societies. And then the issue of climate change. That is actually what we think is a multiplier of security threats. And not just in areas which are far from Europe. And then we have Ukraine and Russia and the crisis. We'll talk about that. The issue with Ukraine has been actually has been the most important crisis, or the crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, is the most important crisis since 1962. And it's something, as I was talking before about 2014, never remember the 24th of February of 2022, because I think that actually has been a turning point in international relations. I have made a list of all the things that I think has changed in terms of in terms of the crisis, and I'll talk about that about the crisis now in a moment. But one of the most important things that the whole architecture of international relations is actually questioned. The UN Security Council doesn't work. It was under criticism before. It doesn't work. It's paralyzed. Diplomacy is questioned. There are some efforts of quiet diplomacy, and that's actually what has actually resulted with Guterres traveling to Moscow this last week, and the evacuation of a number of people, basically from the Azovstal plant, for example, civilians. All that is a result of diplomacy, but you don't have an open process of contact groups of diplomatic engagement. It was very strong at the beginning of the crisis. The Israelis got involved, the Turkish got involved, the French President Macron got involved as well, but it hasn't resulted in anything, at least openly. It is no process that is clear as a possible kind of communication between all parties. No, they do talk, they have these peace talks, but it's not what we have seen in past conflicts at all. Same thing happened with Syria. If you reflect on that, the same thing happened with Syria. We have the biggest refugee crisis in the history of Europe since World War II. And we already thought that the crisis of the former Yugoslavia was something big, but this is huge. And I have to say, with a lot of pride, as a former NATO, well, not only as a NATO employee, but also as an alumni from Deusto, that it shows a lot of the quality of this university, like the fact that you have opened your arms to these colleagues from Ukraine. I think these people have an amazing role to play in the future. I do think that this is the best university in Spain, and the fact that the best university in Spain actually opens its arms to these people who are the ones who will actually rebuild Ukraine is actually very telling. So thank you for that on behalf of NATO. It's very telling and it's very important. So in anything that you can do to support them, please do, because they will have a very difficult role to play in the coming years. One of the things that we have, or the criticisms that we have in the crisis of Ukraine, is that basically NATO is not getting involved. And I'd like to speak to you about that. If you have questions, I'll be more than happy to elaborate. But Article 5 is very clear. And one of the objectives of NATO in this crisis has been to support Ukraine, but not to escalate. And I'm very happy to speak about it later, but clearly one of the reasons why we don't want to escalate is because the risk of nuclear war is there, is always there. The use of tactical weapons of war, it's always a possibility. So it's a very difficult situation to manage politically, because on one hand, you have a country that has been actually invaded in clear contravention of international law. Its sovereignty has been violated. There are millions of refugees and internally displaced people. The infrastructure has been destroyed, it's been destroyed. And at the same time, basically, we have to, the number one priority is to contain the crisis and to avoid escalation. So it's a very tricky situation from the political and the military side. And it also highlights the importance of dialogue. I want to tell you, because I was part of that as well, that up to the last moment, NATO was talking to Russia and trying to speak to Russia, and not to break the diplomatic dialogue with Russia. And it was Russia which was not interested in following up. And I can tell you, I cannot tell you the details, but I can tell you that I have been in meetings with very senior Russian officials, and it was clear. They shut the door. They closed the door. At one point, they closed the door to the NATO dialogue, unfortunately. And then looking forward, what's coming, I'm going to leave a little bit of the Ukraine crisis, because I would imagine there will be a number of questions later. It's basically the Madrid summit and the new strategic concept. It's basically like the idea of having a new strategic concept that encapsulates and is able to work, or give us some sort of guidance when it comes to what NATO should be doing with China, for example. How should we deal with climate change? how should we deal with this push for technological edge to keep the technological superiority to guarantee our freedom. And that's actually going to be fascinating. So I would invite you to actually watch it, because you're going to have it all over the news. We'll have a YouTube a program on it. We'll have quite a lot of things from the NATO side. And with this, I stop here, so I don't bore you with my official speech, but I think we're going to get into the questions and answers, which I think is the best part of any presentation, I hope. So thank you so much.
Well, many thanks, Joaquin, for your rich presentation and also challenging. And well, you've put on the table the challenges that NATO, but not only NATO, that we as Europeans and as citizens have in light of the Ukrainian crisis. Okay, so we have now around 20-25 minutes for comments, questions. I'm sure that you have some pressing issues to be asked to, and I think that we should take the opportunity to ask questions to Joaquin Molina, because he's in one of the hot spots when it comes to the question of security, not only in Europe but also beyond Europe. So the floor is open, and Fatuma from the LLM in International Legal Studies will pass the micro. So just raise your hand, and we will provide with the micro. Any question, please? Fatuma, over there. Yeah.
Do you think that now we are in a real risk of getting in a war with Russia? I mean, NATO, of being in a war with Russia?
That's the question that worries all of us. It's it's a very tricky situation, and the risk for escalation is real. I mean, one of the things that we have seen in this crisis that, and people, you will see that, and I obviously am not disclosing anything which is confidential because I couldn't, but it's all over the news. And actually surprising that this crisis is, including the intelligence, it was very smart. That was shared with the press, so nobody could say that, it was clear, we shared all the intelligence, especially the Americans, shared all the intelligence with the press. So people had been prepared for this war psychologically better than any other time in history. And they need details which were really sharp. And I personally think that the US intelligence community has gained a lot of credibility, because one of the things I didn't mention was actually our intervention, and our basically intervention in terms of building capacity in Iraq. But remember 2003 in Iraq, when the Americans were saying they're weapons of mass destruction, and they were not. So this has to rebuild, because everything they said happened. So and they had very accurate intelligence about that, and that's to our pride that we basically. So in answer to your question, it is very tricky. It is very tricky because we have basically, and I tell you, there are three things I want to mention on this aspect. One is that the first thing that NATO has done is to reinforce its eastern kind of flank, right? We have been talking about it for a long time, but of course, we were very clear, we don't want to look as threatening Russia. But the ones that Russia threatens us by creating instability and attacking Ukraine, countries like the Baltic countries felt very threatened. And also not only the Baltic countries, but many other countries like Poland, like Hungary, like Romania felt very threatened. And we have multiple, before we had 4 battle groups, which is basically a military structure that we deploy to be able to defend our countries. Now we have 8. So we have done, the first thing that we have done, and I will be very frank, is actually think about NATO. So the defense of NATO, make sure that we look credible. And these 4 battle groups are real. It's one thing that you will see it's a tradition in Russian history by now. And we can talk about George Kennan and the long telegram, and how much Soviet Russia had changed vis-a-vis Imperial Russia. But what now we have seen is that there is a long tradition in Russia of basically like Potemkin villages and Potemkin images. Potemkin meaning fake, like, you know, it's the Soviet Union collapsed so quickly because one of the reasons is that was based on lies. Like people were saying they were meeting the targets of production for potatoes, for nuclear weapons and all that. It was all fake. They didn't. And now you have seen that in Russia. In 2008, when Russia actually attacked Georgia, the Russians drew lessons. One of them is that they were not ready, that they had a lot of problems in logistics, in communication. They haven't changed. The same problems. Like it's really not what we expected. So we have seen that the Russian army is much weaker than we thought, and it has been degrading very quickly. This said, Russia has nuclear weapons, and the risk of escalation is real, especially also the use of tactical weapons. What you can actually read in the press and in the informed press or in Foreign Affairs, any other magazine that you want to read, is that actually like a lot of lessons from 1962 and of the crisis in Cuba, no? And one of the questions that when you look back at the Cold War, what is true, and to their credit, is that the Soviets were very self-contained. So every time there was escalation, at one point, they stopped. So that to their credit and to their diplomats. But there was communication, there were back channels, there was a red phone that they would use to communicate with each other, to understand, basically to understand their motivations, but also to try to avoid misunderstandings. And just to give you another example about 1962 and the importance of containing the crisis and why it's important not to be overconfident with the situation is that in 1962, when Kennedy was asked by his brother, by Robert Kennedy, who was also assassinated later, about what he thought were the possibilities of nuclear war, the president of the United States said 1 in 3, which is very high. And everything that has been done since in terms of research in the archives of the Russian has not changed that probability. So we're very close to nuclear war in 1962. So just to say, are we close to nuclear war today? I mean, that's the thing. Like obviously nobody can give you an answer. We want to think that we're talking about rational actors, but of course the threshold for nuclear, the use of nuclear weapons might be reduced. I'm not saying it is reduced, but it might be reduced by the fact that the Russian military, the conventional military, is so ineffective, and that it has been humiliated. Maybe you look at the original advance, the Blitzkrieg, as they would say in German, like the attack against Kiev, that resulted in nothing. You have an army with one thing which is missing, which is fundamental in any army, is the non-commissioned officers. So basically the people who keep the discipline in any NATO army is a very, very strong core of non-commissioned officers that is missing. And that's actually what you have in Wuhan is basically like all these war crimes is like, I don't know, because you have a proper investigation, human rights investigation about what happened, and a criminal investigation, but I would not be surprised if part of those war crimes is actually the result of Russian troops being totally, on the loose, because there is no internal discipline at all. It might also be that there's a very direct plan to scare the population by having these kind of war crimes, which we cannot rule either, as it was in the case in former Yugoslavia. But going back to 1962, like one of the things that I want to worry about is again this overconfidence, because now we know that, and we didn't know that at the time. The Americans didn't know that at the time when they proceeded to the blockade of Cuba, is that actually the Russian troops in Cuba already had nuclear weapons. They had 100 nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. And not only that, they had the authorization to use them in theater without having to call Moscow. So like basically the bottom line is that there was 1 in 3 possibilities for nuclear war, but at the same time, like they were much readier than we thought. The nuclear weapons were already in Cuba. They were not coming to Cuba, they were already in Cuba. So just to say that we have to be, at the end of the day, my trade is diplomacy, and I'll have a final word on that to invite you to think about that as a career. But diplomacy is about dialogue, even with the devil. And I often shook the hand of the devil in my professional life. But there was a higher good, I don't know when I will be judged in the afterlife, but there was a higher good as a professional. It's like, we want to have peace. We want to have a process. We have to have a peace process, for example, that eventually will be supported by a reconciliation commission and everything that has to do with human rights and investigation of war crimes. But we have to have that, again, to de-escalate. So again, in answer to your question in 2 seconds, like we cannot tell how big the probability is. Hopefully not that big. Hopefully like the Putin, because this is very much Putin's war, not Russia's war, I think, will actually come to terms. And important countries like China that have so far missed an opportunity to have a very positive influence on international affairs will actually get involved.
Okay, well, there is a question from the online audience. It reads as follows. I would like to ask, what are the main reasons for NATO's different strategy in the Ukraine war compared to its role in the Yugoslav war?
It's a very good question. Again, it relates to the main threat, and the main threat in the case of Ukraine is obviously Russia. In the case of Ukraine, of the former Yugoslavia, was basically, it started as a civil conflict, as a basic civil war, and actually became eventually, when they declared independence, an international war. Although they had, it was basically a collection of wars within the same territory, because you had the war in Kosovo, you had the war between different factions in Bosnia, etc., etc. So the main reason was basically, first of all, the UN Security Council was able to authorize military operations because it was united. And even when and that I also want to say, for example, when you talk, I work a lot, including with the negotiation of the final status process of Kosovo, but I also work on the military operation on KFOR. And one of the things that when you look at UN Security Council Resolution 1244, which is the basis for the military presence of NATO in Kosovo, and like any other military peacekeeping operation authorized by the United Nations, it has not to be renewed every 6 months or no, that's always there until it changes, until it's actually superseded by the UN Security Council. And that was because it was so difficult to negotiate that the Russians said, yes, we go for it. The Chinese said, we go for it, but we don't have to review it. And we wanted to do the same thing. No? So just to say that, I mean, in terms of the former Yugoslavia, the architecture of the international community has some sort of communality. Sometimes it was very small, but it was there. And at this point, basically, we see a very big gap in what should be the most important forum for international politics, which is the UN Security Council, in terms of how we approach that. Again, because one of the members of the UN Security Council is part of the conflict, is actually the aggressor in the conflict. So that makes it totally different. And thus, the response of NATO is tailored to that. No? And again, in the case of the former Yugoslavia, we had a negative impact on NATO security, but the one in Ukraine is even bigger. I mean, what we have seen since and because the world has become so much more interconnected in 2022 than it was in 1991. Like the room for maneuver is different, and the whole scheme is different. I mean, we talk about the weaponization of everything now. Basically, we have migrants have been weaponized everywhere, to the detriment of human rights and to the detriment of the individuals. Technology has been weaponized. We have weaponized the internet. We have weaponized trade, and we talk about later, if you want, about the energy and the oil trade between Europe and Russia. And I will explain why it is so difficult for NATO or EU countries to actually switch from one thing to the other overnight. We have weaponized everything in today's world. Technology, I mean, you see, for example, now how the Russian tanks are being defeated with drones or with javelins. Basically, like a tank is worth a lot of money. And then any of you in the audience, actually, we can train you to shoot something on a tank that will destroy the tank in 2 days. And you move around with this thing in the back, and you can destroy a tank. You can use drones, as they have been used by both sides in the Ukraine conflict, and you can have the technological advantage, which is something that you will see in Madrid. We're going to make a big bet on technology in Madrid, because we think, and I see many people here with a computer, the internet, think about it, the internet in origin is a military project. So if you invest in defense, it's not just buying uniforms, it's just not buying tanks, it's also like buying a technology that is going to be applicable to many other things. It's going to have a spillover effect, which is magnificent. And universities like Deusto have an amazing role to play in that. And not just from the technical point of view in terms of the technology and the mechanics and let's say the engineering, but also into the regulation, because one of the most difficult aspects we're going to see now is actually how to regulate the use of drones or like technology in warfare, in international humanitarian law. That's a fascinating and a very difficult challenge. And those two can actually play a role in that. That's actually a very hot topic.
Okay. Fatuma, please.
Okay. According to Putin, NATO promised in the 80s that it will not move east, and it has done it, including or hosting countries like Poland or Romania. So do you think that is his anger with NATO understandable?
That is basically what the Russians have been saying for a long time. The promise, according to Putin, was made right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So basically, it was made to the Russian authorities at the time. But this is like what they say. I mean, we do not understand in NATO that we made such a promise, or actually that the United States made such a promise. No, so like it's. At the end of the day, when we have what I said before, an open door policy means that, you know, if you have the values, if you have the interest, you're a sovereign nation, you can decide whether you want to be neutral or whether your security interest is going to be better served by being part of NATO and contributing to that. Okay, so that and that is basically the old Russian story about NATO not delivering on a promise. But my argument, and I was trained as a lawyer here in Deusto, so I hope to be good, is that, well, I mean, what did you do as Russia to reassure your neighbors that they didn't have to come to NATO? Because like, I mean, when I look back at our history, I mean, since that alleged promise was made, I mean, Russia has not done very much. At the beginning, when I first started my career in NATO, the issue was keeping Russia strong, because nobody wants a weakened Russia. I mean, Russia has to be strong. It's part of Europe. It has been part of Europe. It has an amazing society. It has an amazing people. The young people of Russia are fantastic. They're very smart. They are very willing to do things, but they live in a certain regime at the moment. But Russia is not going to move out. I mean, we cannot put the map. We cannot push it to the right. So it's part of Europe. And we are the number one, the organization which is the most interested in having a good relation with Russia is actually NATO. But as I said, you know, like as Russia, what have you done to reassure your neighbors? Like show what you can do to your own population in Grozny in the 90s, for example, 3 times or 4 times. Like see how you treat Aleppo or Syria when you get involved in an international conflict. So rather than mediating between the parties, rather than getting involved, you actually bomb hospitals as they are doing in Ukraine, violating international humanitarian law, having, and I say alleged crimes because we are in a law faculty and we have to be respectful with the presumption of innocence, but you know, like human rights and conducting massive violations like Putin, using energy as a weapon, using migrants as a weapon in Belarus against Poland, like undermining the international legality in Africa, in the Central African Republic, with the Wagner Group. So I can go on and on and on. I mean, I'm actually asking you, would you actually believe the Russian side if they behave like that? Would you be scared if you are sitting next to Russia as a country? Would you look protection under the NATO umbrella, which you know works? So it's a very personal, I just leave it there.
Hi. Putin has several times referred to a domination of Western culture. And I wanted to ask you if you think that it exists a culture of NATO as such, like a culture shared by members of NATO.
Well, the culture of NATO countries is very rich. and it's getting richer by the fact that you have very important migration coming into Europe. So meaning that the culture of Europe it has changed a lot in the last 20 years and is meant to change even more. And for me, diversity means basically like this richness in terms of the culture. So like, yes, there is a Western European culture. There's an American pop culture as well, or an American Western culture that has gone all around. And we have values which are attached to that culture, like democracy, human rights, the defense of human rights, the value of international rules-based order that you will see very prominent in Madrid. So all that is culture, but Tchaikovsky is also culture. I mean, and there's much more recent, culture like pop groups and in Russia, which have very good music. So Russia is a very interesting country because it's the largest country in the world. It's Asian and European in not just geographical terms, but also in ways of thinking. But that's why it's so rich. It has a very small population spread over a very, very vast extension of land. And it has an amazing culture that benefits from that, from Central Asia to Vladivostok to Petersburg. St. Petersburg. So you have all this richness, and we just want them to be part of it. We don't want them to be destroying another country which also has a very rich culture and a very rich history. And of course, as somebody said, the Balkans, I think it was Winston Churchill, has more history than they can digest. And forgive me if the quote is wrong, but it's not actually accredited to him. But it's like that. Europe has much more history than we can digest. But we need at one point to have a common narrative to live together. And the narrative is basically like we have common values. And if you want to share those values, yes, come and join. And if you don't want to join, have a dialogue, So he has very strong views. We know that because he has been very vocal on a number of human rights issues. And he's proposing an alternative kind of approach to government, like China as well, with social control, with these kind of things. And at the end of the day, it's not ideology, as it was in the Soviet Union, but it's an alternative model of social organization. And it so happened to be an autocracy. So like you choose which side you want to be in.
Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. At the moment, relationships between Spain and Morocco are not at their best. And as far as I know, Ceuta and Melilla are not protected by the NATO agreement. So in case of an invasion from Morocco, would there be any NATO assistance? Thank you.
I cannot give you an answer to that one, unfortunately. But what I can tell you is that what's very, very important is that, and I'm a firm believer. Actually, I was very involved with the United Nations as well as the World Bank on a project they had on conflict prevention. Because what we see in terms of conflict, be that international conflict or civil war, is that once you get into a dynamic of conflict, it's very difficult to get out of it. And the drivers of conflict are such that they actually mortgage a society for decades, not years, decades. You see that in terms of even I'm going to be very frank, even in the case of Spain, for example, we had a civil war a long time ago, and we still talk about it, and we still feel very passionate about it, and still argue about it as it has happened yesterday. Same thing in Italy, same thing in many other parts of the world. Colombia has a peace process still ongoing, and you see what is the result of a peace process. It takes a long, long time. So the most important thing for me is, again, regardless of the thing I really cannot give an answer to, but it's actually that we focus your thinking as students and the thinking of the intellectual community that basically lives in a faculty, be that the law faculty of international relations, on creating the professionals that can actually identify the drivers of conflict to prevent conflict. Because that's actually the most important subject for me in international relations. Is not conflict mediation, conflict resolution, all these things we have tried, but conflict prevention is still missing. It's still missing. Like the technique to do that effectively is still missing. Confidence building between nations.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is that the Pope Francis has recently made some statements saying that the invasion of Ukraine is a reaction of Russia to the pressures of the NATO. So what do you think about these statements and the role of the Vatican in the war? Thank you.
Who made the statement? I didn't hear.
Pope Francis.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a very, I mean, like international, from the point of view of international law, it's clear what has happened. It's a violation of international law, and that is clear. And when it comes to the role of the Vatican diplomacy, for example, who has been very active, probably behind, obviously, they do a lot of things behind the scenes. Ukraine is a very interesting case because Pope Francis, as well as his predecessors, basically in that St. Peter's chair, they have been very active in approaching the Orthodox world or the Catholic Church to the Orthodox world. And what we have seen here is that the hierarchy of the Orthodox Church in Russia, because my wife is actually Orthodox, she's Greek Orthodox, but she's Orthodox. It's really like on the same boat with Putin, it seems. So like that makes it very difficult to actually try to influence a religious hierarchy to move basically on the basis of the gospel and the values that the gospel defends in terms of peace and reconciliation. Very difficult. And also, if you look at a book that was criticized quite a lot in the 1990s because it presented a reality that many people didn't want to read, but I think it's a really useful book to inform your discussion anytime. It's actually the one on the war of civilizations of Huntington, no? The conflict between civilization. And if you read that book, you see that Ukraine is actually at the fault line between the Orthodox Christian world and the Catholic world, right? So that's a very interesting religious aspect to it. And of course, you have the division between the decision by the Ukrainian church to split from Moscow and to have, so there's a lot of religious component, a very strong religious component in the narrative of both sides in this conflict, particularly in the Russian side. Very, very strong.
Hi, considering the difference in framework and way of working between the UN and NATO, how has the relationship changed between the two organizations since this crisis began?
Well, that's a very good question. It's a very difficult, I mean, the relationship has been very rich. No, I mean, NATO doesn't do anything without a UN Security Council mandate, for example, when it comes to military operation, right? Everything we did actually has a UN Security Council mandate. There's one exception. At the beginning of the Kosovo crisis, basically like we intervened without a UN Security Council resolution. So basically we entered without it, or intervened in the conflict. And then we got 1244 to bless kind of the NATO presence, right? So it has not always been easy, but it has been very rich. And what happens now is that we have a very good relationship with the Secretariat, because people in New York or in Geneva, for example, they value the work that NATO does. Some of them actually have direct experience of working with us in Afghanistan or in other parts of the world, and they see what we are able to do and provide. For example, and not just the United Nations, the African Union, for example. The African Union relies on NATO for transporting their troops in Africa, from one peacekeeping operation to another, and deploying their contingents, and for education as well. So they see the value in working with NATO. But of course, what I was saying before is that the whole architecture since 1945, even nominally, has been based on the UN Security Council that worked. It didn't work during the Cold War because of the Cold War. Now, it worked for a few years, for a long period, actually, because Russia, China, the US, UK, France, the permanent members of the UN Security Council were able to do business and help the world, sometimes very late, sometimes not as well as they could, but they helped. And we've had a very good relation with that. Now, what you have is that it's not only the UN Security Council is paralyzed, it's also that many of the formats that have helped us, and some are informal, to actually like deal with the crisis that we have had in the past, have actually been undermined. i.e. the G7 plus Russia at the time, there's no Russia in the G7 anymore. The G20, very important. When I was talking about the financial crisis of 2008, the G20 was key in answering to, in giving a concerted answer to the financial crisis of 2008, which was, as I said, will be a very important date in history. Now the G20, like with what's happening, is totally divided. So we don't have concerted action from that point of view, and we need to have it. I mean, as we need to create the formats, we need to make the formats that exist work, and we need to address that. And again, like the issue of Russia is not, don't take me as a warmonger that we don't want war with Russia. We want the war to stop, and we want war crimes to stop in Ukraine and everywhere else as well, but especially in Ukraine. And we want basically like to have Russia as an interlocutor. That's what we always wanted. But Putin's Russia is not behaving the way that it's basically like a rogue state in the way it behaves. Again, like we also have to give the room for diplomacy. And that's one thing that basically when we're talking about the threshold for nuclear war and all that, you need to have some room for maneuver for the other side, that we need to see how what are the intentions, what are the capabilities as well, what is the strategy, whether at one point basically they will signal they change the attitude. It's also in war, as in love, everything is possible.
Hi. So does NATO expect to end the war in May 9th, or at least to be as decisive as they say, as Russia says?
Well, Putin himself has said that May 9th is not the victory of Europe, victory in Europe day is not actually the date for the cutoff, no? It is very difficult to say. I mean, like the Russians have been the masters of frozen conflicts. So every time they had a frozen, I always say that in NATO, like, whenever it's like Joaquin Molina, what do you think about, without being an expert on Russia, is that whenever I dealt with, right, in the context of a frozen conflict, they are the masters. They really know the technique. They know how to keep it frozen. So sometimes they can heat it. Sometimes like something you can put in a sort of microwave machine. Like you can put it and it's warm, and then it's like in a cold, and I can rewarm it again. And you have to worry about it all the time. But they haven't proved very skilled at conducting the military operation in Ukraine. Again, like that should never get us into hubris, into thinking we are the best and we are safe. No, we have to work as if we were not. And to make sure that we are safe, we have to put a lot of effort every day on the diplomatic as well as particularly the military side. But when it comes to the 9th of May in terms of I think who knows what Putin thinks. But I wouldn't be surprised, and this is Joaquin speaking, it's not in an intelligence-based information at all. But I wonder whether he would actually take the same decision on the 24th of February if he could go back. I'm pretty sure he wouldn't. Because for as much as they say, like we are succeeding, we are basically like, so far it's failure. They said 20% of the territory of Ukraine is actually occupied by Russia today. The infrastructure is very much damaged, particularly in the areas that have been bombed. You have this massive brain drain with the refugees, this massive drama in the country, this massive trauma, which is something that needs to be actually assessed, because like the fact that you have someone safe as well in the West doesn't mean that the person is right as well. Like all these situations have a lot of traumas, and I invite you as colleagues of these people that will be coming from Ukraine to help these people, because you need to understand these people have gone through a lot. Nobody chooses to be either a refugee or an internally displaced person. And I tell you that from personal experience because my wife was a refugee. So like she works now for the United Nations. But just to say that it is a very heavy luggage that they break, no? So again, with the 9 May, and go back to the question, nobody knows. I would doubt that anything, because if he had something really important to present as a victory by that time, like which is actually around the corner, it's next week. So like, maybe he could stop there and say, it could also be that, as some people speculate, he could declare total war, which means that actually he would declare war. And then that means that actually they would have to mobilize the conscripts all throughout Russia. Conscription in Russia is not popular at all. And you just have to look at Russian history and see, like, every time they have conscripted people, they had trouble. 1917, 1905, they don't live in the time of the serfs anymore. And they need to understand that. So, question mark, we'll see. We'll learn very fast, very quickly, or actually very soon, whether the 9th of May is actually a turning point for Putin's strategy or not.
Thank you.
So thank you for all the answers so far. And I have a question to IHL and whether you think there's a need for an AP4 to the Geneva Conventions, or if there's a need to just reinforce how we see the Geneva law and how we make states compliant to it.
Very good question. I think the first thing we need to do is to make sure that the states comply with Geneva. There's also the element, for example, now, and that's related but separate, the issue of the international court, basically the International Criminal Court. No? And as I said before, I was the channel for the many of the cases in the former Yugoslavia, but I mean, we need to sign the treaty. And some of the people who actually are saying, we're going to bring Putin to justice, international justice, excuse me, first sign the treaty yourself. So like
the US,
including the United States. I mean, and again, this is like Joaquin speaking, not the NATO person, but just to say that, you know, like it's important that we have that discussion, right? So like what I can tell you is that all NATO countries, all of them, support the Geneva Conventions and apply the Geneva Conventions. Not a single one is basically doesn't do it. You know, of course there are mistakes. Like in every time you get into a conflict situation, you're bound to have mistakes. I mean, I've been dealing with post-conflict, and I have been physically in conflict in a conflict area, and I tell you it's very confusing. I mean, when I was in Baghdad in 2010, for example, no, when you have rockets falling on you, you know. Like we have snipers, you know, like all this stuff, you know, like it's very difficult to make sense of things, including for a person with a military training, which I don't have. No, so the first thing I would say is like, yes, we need to develop the Geneva Conventions. Possibly, I will leave that to a more informed person, because the war has changed, conflict has changed. As I said, we have weaponized many things. We also have to, in my opinion, inject the spirit of Geneva into many other conventions or many other areas of international law, because we have weaponized from information, from fake news to migrants, to, as I said, to trade. So all that has to be informed with the spirit of Geneva. And perhaps, yes, we'll probably have to develop Geneva further, because war is changing constantly, and technology has brought an incredible advancement in warfare that, as I said, has to be regulated. And if you're interested as part of the Deusto family, I would invite you to take a professional role in doing that, because we are going to need a lot of very bright people to be able to regulate international humanitarian law. But again, since you give me the answer, I will repeat the issue that I said before. When NATO troops deploy, they have a card and they have training on the Geneva Conventions, and not just on human rights as they are defined, you know, in the context of the Geneva Conventions, prisoners of war, but also, for example, the protection of cultural heritage and religious heritage, which is very important. When I was a student in the Netherlands, so a peaceful place, I will see places where we're marked as a cultural like property for war, according to Geneva. I mean, and that in when I was there in 1994, it was surprising how come that they do it. But of course, like the country had been destroyed in World War II, and you never know. And you have seen destruction of cultural property, certainly a lot of it in Iraq, and in Syria, and in Afghanistan with the Taliban bombing the famous Buddha like statues there. And I mean, I was myself, and we can talk about that offline if you want, I was very much involved in the reconstruction of the Mostar Bridge, basically supporting the project because that's what I had to do politically, but the reconstruction of an Ottoman bridge, that is a fascinating story. We can talk about that without boring anyone, but that was cultural heritage, and that was destroyed on purpose. It was not a tank that had shot a bullet or randomly. They tried to decide. They wanted to destroy the bridge because it was an example of the past and the cultural and the link between the east side of Mostar, which is Muslim, and the west side of Mostar, which is Christian.
Thank you for the presentation. Sweden and Finland are about to make a decision in a few weeks about to submit an application to join NATO, and that will be a huge change in the security policy of the Nordic countries. And since Finland, for example, have this super long border to Russia, how do you think these applications could affect the international security situation?
Well, in terms of the ifs, no, like if they find out, are you from Sweden or Finland? Yeah, of course. So basically, if that happens, which is a sovereign right, technically they are ready. So like they are part of many of the NATO discussions already today. I have worked a lot with Finland and Sweden, with diplomats from both. They're fantastic people, the military. So they are at the same standard. Sometimes when you have the open door policy and you have a country that wants to join NATO, you have to deal with corruption in the civil system. You have to deal with the very low military standards. You have to get them to that. But Sweden and Finland have like the same standard that we have. So they are in tomorrow if they want. Again, if they want, your sovereign decision is to apply for. And of course, it is true that Finland has a very long border with Russia. Let's not forget that Russia lost a war to Finland, the Winter War. So like, if they open the history books, and given the fact that they haven't changed much their tactics since then, I will be very cautious. But again, the potential for trouble is there. And it's also cyber, and you don't need to have a border with Russia, with any other country to have problems. One of the reasons why you don't see more problems, and there are problems with the cyber attacks from Russia today, is because we have prepared for those. So it's not that they're not happening, and I cannot say much, but they happen, but we prepare better, including with private companies. So the physical proximity, we can go back to Napoleon and say, if you want to study the foreign policy of a country, just look at the map. And it is true. But at the same time, today has also changed. The threats don't have to come only through a physical border. But again, the one question there is, if Sweden and Finland apply for membership, I will be very surprised if they don't get in. Let's speculate. I will be very surprised. Is the speed of the ratification process, because between the moment, of course, that you apply and you're accepted, and that is very fast, to the moment you are in, it can be lengthy. And we never got, and that's something that I have to that's again Joaquin Molina speaking, not the NATO official, but we have never been in this situation of having two countries, if they ever apply for NATO membership, applying in this context. So of course, I want to think that NATO countries and the legislatives will be very quick in ratifying. But this ratification process, the window, you can say it has some vulnerability for both countries. So it has to be as short as possible, because the protection of Article 5 is not there until you're a member. At the same time, they're EU countries. There's not that to be forgotten. No? So being an EU country is, not only for Russia, but also for China, in terms of anything that happens. China, again, is probably missing a good opportunity to do some good for the world here by doing what it's doing. And again, in the same way that say Putin's Russia, I want to say she's China, because I'm pretty sure, I'm not a China expert either, but I'm pretty sure that the Chinese system is not all that happy with what is happening. And China is very strong, and is getting very strong, even stronger, but it's also has a lot of issues. And you see that in the way that they dealt with COVID in Shanghai, recently. You see that in the way that the economy is slowing down. You see the demographic crisis that they have. There are a lot of issues that they have to deal with. So again, going back to the question, it's going to be an interesting time.
Hi, what is the NATO stand on a possible attack on Moldova? Is it possible?
Sorry, the NATO?
What is the NATO stand on a possible attack on Moldova?
Yeah, well, it will be, I would not like to speculate on that one. And there's one thing that I want to be very clear, because this is within the family, is within the NATO, but one thing that I was all throughout my career is don't speculate on situations like that, on scenarios, because sometimes you open the door for misunderstandings, and that's no good, And that's also one way in which I, for example, think it was very smart to share information and intelligence before the crisis and during the crisis with the public, with all of us. But one rule I always had whenever there was a possible scenario or an operation, when I was doing peacekeeping operations or peace support, is don't give any kind of ideas or operational details. And even the way that we assessed the performance of the Russian, I think sometimes it's far too open, because I think it can lead to misunderstandings. So in that sense, I would not like to speculate on that. What I can tell you, Moldova is a very important partner for NATO, and we are making a big effort to support it. Very important. It's until the war in Ukraine, it was the poorest country in Europe. It has a huge issue with women trafficking, for example, especially for sexual exploitation. And it's a country that has a lot of potential in cultural heritage and everything else. It already suffered because, again, when we have all the pieces as historians, if you go back to this crisis in 20 years' time, you will see that many of these signals of the crisis in Ukraine were building up. For example, the energy crisis that affected Moldova when the Russians were pushing Moldova, the fact that Transnistria, and we speculate that the Russians may want to link Transnistria with the south, the part they are occupying in southern Ukraine. All these things actually are part of a plan, no, clearly, and those some signals were there before, and I think we're reading the signals right.
Okay, well, if I may, based on your experience with, well, you are working relations with the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. How do you see the prospects of the ICC doing something on the, well, allegedly war crimes committed in Ukraine?
It will be difficult to assess. What I think is, I mean, the facts are the following: like there have been war crimes. We may know who committed them. The evidence is pretty clear, and you have a lot of investigating teams. I hope that the Russians take good note of this, and after what they did in Syria, what they did in here, they changed their approach to international humanitarian law, and they actually respect it, because they will benefit, and everybody will benefit from that, including the victims that hopefully will never happen. The investigation ought to be very credible and very professional, and it's happening already. So there's a lot of forensic evidence, which is something that, I mean, from my experience with dealing with the International Court for the former Yugoslavia, no? The tribunal, we had plenty of evidence of many things, and it sometimes was basically intelligence-based, sometimes was like photographic evidence of war graves and mass graves and killings, and it is difficult to say. What I think I'm confident to say is that there is a lot of forensic evidence of what happened, and this has even been filmed. I mean, these things have been filmed. I mean, like you have to assess whether the film is actually, as a proof in a court of justice, whether it's actually real, whether it's actually being manipulated, whether it's actually really manipulated, whether it happened on that day, whether that's the person that you're charging is actually the person inside the tank. All these are a lot of things which have to be proved in a court of justice, but there's a lot of material with that. But again, I hope, I mean, I know it's very sad because we will not bring the people who were like killed alive again, but I hope that but everybody takes note of what it is, and they avoid it. And as you said, that they respect international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions that they are bound to respect.
Okay, well, we have time for one very last question, so please proceed.
So thanks for the presentation. And how is it possible that being a very strategic country, Russia has lost lots of soldiers, military infrastructure, and have not advanced as fast as it was thought at the first moment? How did Russia not expect to be like not so advanced and to lose all those militaries?
That's what we all wonder. We all question that. Why? I mean, I was told in this university to actually avoid monocasual explanations of very complex events, but speculated, because again, we don't know. Like, one thing was, it is clear, one person decided to invade Ukraine, and that is Putin. And I mean, what he decided, obviously you don't decide to get into a military disaster like this one. It's like if basically you would have gone back to I don't know, to basically the first intervention in it was Kennedy, and then Johnson in Vietnam, but already Truman had actually sent support to the French in Vietnam, and Eisenhower. But basically it's like if you go to the US president and you say like, this is Vietnam, are you gonna get involved? And maybe it's not a good idea, So like, when he took the decision to get involved, we think he was very confident that he would get to Kiev like this. If we are to believe what some of the conscripts that have been taking, basically that they have been speaking to their mothers in Russia, or like have been taken prisoners of war by the Ukrainian side, say, is that some of them were in military maneuvers, or the sort of maneuvers that they did before, or they do all the time, all military, all countries in the world. And they were told to invade Ukraine, and they were told that they were actually going to be welcomed. And they had been brainwashed and presented the narratives that people would come with flowers and salt and bread, which is the Ukrainians' welcoming ritual. It didn't happen. On the contrary, they had snipers. The tires of their vehicles were exploded because they are made in China and they are not very good. It seems they were given rations for food that are actually expired. And so, you know, he clearly thought he would win very quickly and impose a puppet regime that, you know, like they have friendly relationship like they have with Belarus. And it didn't happen. On the contrary, he found, and this is the one thing that we can see on Ukraine, is that Ukraine is resilient, and the spirit of the fighting spirit in Ukraine is very high. I mean, that's the most important thing in a war. I mean, when Napoleon invaded Spain in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, what made trouble for Napoleon in Spain was not the regular army, you know, that has a mixed record of success, kind of bad in principle, but it was the fighting spirit of the people all throughout the peninsula that made Spain a problem for it. The same thing with Hitler in Russia. You had the regular army and then you have the partisans, but what you see in Ukraine is that the Ukrainians are very bravely defending the country, and they're very resilient, and their fighting spirit is everything that makes the difference. When you have on the other side these people who, many of them don't want to be there, and certainly don't want to die, certainly not, or maybe even some of them don't want to kill, and certainly less in the way they do. And one aspect to that as well is that something that has been a trend in modern conflict, and I'm not speaking about Ukraine, but this is a fact in, for example, in Syria, is that many of these soldiers basically are given, you know, like amphetamines and things like that, you know, like also in World War II, they were given that to stay awake, but to incite the violence, right? So that's also a factor that have fuels. So the one thing that I will say on Putin is an intelligence officer. That's his education. I mean, by training, you can be a lawyer. I don't know if you belong to the law faculty or you will be a diplomat in the future, but you have that, he has that training. And for a security officer and for an intelligence officer, information is everything. So the fact that he was misinformed is pretty serious, because it's basically what you have been doing all your life, being sure that you're taking a decision based on information. The information you have been fed is wrong. You have been misrepresented the reality in Ukraine. That's a big problem. And the other problem that he has as well is that he has been reinforcing, you know, like we have to see whether he has been reinforcing failure by his military activities, or he's actually, there's a whole strategy behind it that is actually very smart, and we don't know about it now. What I think is Putin is a very, very good tactician, and he's not a very good strategist. And one of the aspects of, like, you know, Ukraine, Finland and Sweden coming to NATO is a side effect of this crisis. If it happens, you know, it's a negative thing for him now. So I think he made a big mistake, and I'm not the only one who thinks that way.
Okay, there is another question from the online audience. In April 2008, on Bucharest summit, Ukraine and Georgia were declined to be granted membership action plan. After a few months, in August, Russia invaded Georgia. It shows that NATO expansion does not have to do anything with Russian aggression to its neighbors. I would like to ask about your opinion. Do you think granting membership action plan 14 years ago could have had better or worse consequences for those countries regarding Russian aggression?
It's a very good question and very informed. So the person writing that obviously knows NATO, has a lot, very strong interest in NATO, has read certainly our website. So that's a very, very, I'm very interested about his knowledge or her knowledge. Difficult to say about the past. What we think is that Russian, I mean, you always have to accept the other side narrative about the feeling of insecurity of Russia, which is permanent. I mean, Russia has felt insecure forever. I mean, one example of that insecurity is 1904. There's a very famous case in international law. It's basically based on the Russians attacking a group of British fishermen on their way to the Far East. So they're basically sailing from the North Port in Russia, taking the fleet towards the Pacific, all around the world to fight the Japanese. And all of a sudden, they meet in the high seas a bunch of ships, and they sink the ships, they attack the ships, and the ships are actually British fishermen, but they thought they were Japanese torpedo boats, like in Europe. So yes, this feeling of insecurity has been there for a long time, and that's an example of that. So not just in the Soviet Union or in modern Russia, it's very old. I don't think the NATO enlargement, because we don't speak about the expansion, has been. I mean, what has triggered this at all is basically the idea that this imperial idea that Putin entertains, that yes, I mean, that they can do, I mean, that Russia is entitled, that Ukraine is a geographical term, is not really like a country that deserves to be a country, and the fact that he doesn't want to have Ukraine as an independent country. Like, think about the other possibilities that Russia had to engage, and Putin's Russia, again, Putin's Russia, to engage with the West and do things with the West. Pipelines. I mean, we have a massive network of pipelines coming from Russia. They sell 60% of their oil and gas to us, to Europe. They're busy in a big market. And that was actually, we always said the European Union is based on trade, and trade means peace. So that's a case in which trade hasn't brought peace at the time, for the time being, no? And it's a missed opportunity, because we could have actually built on that. I honestly think that it might be, but again, it's speculating, that it might be when Ukraine got closer to Europe, to the EU, that triggered the Russian decision to do something in Ukraine, because NATO is, as I said, is a group of sovereign countries designed by consensus. One more country at the table makes consensus more difficult. But when it comes to the EU, you are basically like, you participate in the decision-making process, but the EU orders a whole society. NATO doesn't order a whole society. We have very clear, it's a shield for freedom, but we don't order. Like, we have standards for the military, but we don't order like what kind of food, whether you can actually have a certain standards for like the NATO, the EU flag, for example. No? And that reminds me of the case of people in Brexit who were trying to burn the EU flag, and they couldn't, because of course the EU flag was built, or was actually had been, produced up to EU standards. So it's actually, it cannot burn for safety.
So just another question, if I may. You've spoken a bit about energy and the pipelines that span from Russia to EU into NATO territory. Do you think that NATO has made a mistake in the past by relying on this fossil fuels coming from Russia and not boosting EU countries and Western countries to go for renewables? Because we see now that it's a security issue that is fueling this war as well.
NATO per se, no, because it doesn't have the power to do that. But I personally think that NATO countries have missed an opportunity, and missing one of them. And the question with Russian oil, because I want to explain that, because I dealt for a very brief period with oil markets, is that, and that's when you say like, oh, we shouldn't buy, I mean, those people say, we advocate that we shouldn't buy Russian oil. Why shouldn't buy Russian oil? We should buy, no, there's already a technical issue, like basically 40% of the oil in Europe is coming from Russia. And I'm not talking about gas, oil. But oil in Russia is called the Ural oil, which is very heavy. And those refineries that are actually building and using that to produce the gasoline that you use in your car have to have a technical specification. So they cannot just, it's like if you're driving a diesel and all of a sudden, I mean, you say, well, I want to have gasoline. It doesn't work. Or the other way around, it doesn't work. It's different. So like if you're buying Middle East oil, it's lighter. So the refining process from the point of view of engineering is different. and it requires adaptation. What happens is that as we are adapting to new oil, different oil sources in the world, we are, yes, missing an opportunity to do that. The problem we have with clean energy is that the key to clean energy is actually like the way you store it. And to store energy, you need batteries. And battery technology is still lagging behind, and is highly dependent on minerals, which happen to be in the wrong hands very often. So like, including, like many countries that have a more difficult relationship with the West. So is basically that, yes, we are missing an opportunity. We already miss it to push for that green technology. You will see in the new SRE concept, as I said, that climate change is taken very seriously by NATO, by NATO as an organization. But NATO in terms of climate change can do very little, because what we can is introduce standards for our militaries to be more efficient. But there is a limit to how fast you can do that. Because if you're saying we want to defend the airspace in the Baltic countries, any sortie with any of these planes not only costs a lot of money, but also pollutes, right? But if you do not scramble a Russian plane, you're giving the impression you're not engaging and you are not serious in terms of defending. So it's a very tricky question to answer. But yes, I think we ought to use this as an opportunity. Like the Chinese say that a crisis, the character for crisis is the same as opportunity, right? So yes, we have a crisis which is very serious, but let's try to make it an opportunity. To make it up to engage with other countries, to change our energy, to many other things.
Well, last question.
You have previously referred to the Putin's war instead of Russian war. So I would like to know what you believe could happen with Putin after the failure in Ukraine, as his strategy completely failed.
He hasn't failed yet. I mean, it seems like the war is still going on. So we have to see what he achieves militarily, whether he changes course. What happens is that, I mean, and again, it's Joaquin speaking. It's not Joaquin, the NATO official. He's making his hole bigger and deeper. I mean, the moment that you have war crimes and they're exposed, your room for maneuver vis-a-vis the international community is becoming more limited. Still, let's not forget one thing, which is important, and I have to be fair, and I need to mention that, is that the invasion of Ukraine has united the West. But not all countries in the world, and we truly live in a we can talk about the interconnection, because I have my question doubts about how like the more interconnected world will actually develop after COVID first and the Ukraine war. But if you speak about the rest of the world, they do not always have the same perception of Russia. Some basically because of the geographical situation don't care. Some basically support Russia. Sometimes they don't criticize Russia because of trade reasons or whatever. So we have to be very, very, and for that I would actually ask you to look at the UN Security Council, so the UN General Assembly voting, who voted for, against, abstained, in condemning the invasion of Ukraine. I think that it's very difficult to tell you at the moment, to be honest. It's very, very difficult. But I mean, if I were to make a wish for a policy, and the first thing we do, and you will see that, and I have a final word on that, inviting you to think about diplomacy, is that basically hope is not a policy. You have to prepare for the worst. And we have to, think about ways of doing that, engaging with Russia, making Russia to change, but also stopping the war. And there's whole issue of what happened there and accountability for that. That's very serious. The war, starting the war, and the crimes.
Well, thank you very much, Joaquin Molina, for this conference. It has been a privilege to have you here in Deusto. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge, experience, impressions. Sometimes when you are students, you have this opportunity in this very difficult situation as we are living now, a war in Europe. We watch television, we read internet, the newspapers, and to have the opportunity to listen to an official of NATO here in Deusto, in the university, I think that has been really, really a privilege for all of us. Perhaps in the future, one of the students here present will work for NATO. I don't know. Perhaps the last words are for you, Joaquin, and if you can give them a piece of advice, and we close the conference. So thank you very much, Joaquin.
Thank you very much. The privilege has been entirely mine. I knew you were bright cookies before I came, but I tell you are brighter, even brighter than I was described, and they were very kind. So, like, you know, you're really bright. You have an amazing future ahead, and I would invite you to not only think about NATO. We have internships as well, and many other things. Again, for like a bit older people than you are at present. So enjoy your youth, because it's a very fun time to have. But so don't be in a rush. But it's a very. I wanted to make a last plea is that when I was a student here, I mean, as Deusto students, right, you can change the world. I mean, the current foreign minister of Spain was my classmate. So, like, I mean, higher than that in terms of foreign policy in Spain today, that is difficult to get, actually, for the prime minister. But just to say that, you know, like, you are rubbing shoulders with people who will be the next foreign minister or a future foreign minister of Ukraine, of Poland, of Sweden, maybe, or, you know, you name it, of Kenya, maybe. So, like, you know, you are very privileged. And this society, I mean, this basic university, based on the values of the Society of Jesus, actually has a lot to do in terms of like how you actually shape the world. One way to shape the world is, I don't want this to sound like join the Navy and see the world, so join NATO and see the world, but it's international civil service. My wife works for the United Nations in human rights, and I have worked most of my life on security policy, and most of my life for NATO. So it's a very interesting way in which we can actually advance our values as alumni from Deusto, as well as the national values of whatever country you come from India to wherever. So, like, I would strongly advise you to think about it. You're very, very young, but when I was sitting there, like, I basically very early in my studies decided to be an international civil servant, and I basically happened to realize what was my interest. And you can do a lot. So be ambitious, work very hard. Again, coming from someone who was not particularly a very good student here, but work very hard, use every opportunity to grow, including any kind of exchange you have with another university, and just not to stand before my talk and the lunch, you know, enjoy. I'm here for you as an alumni anytime, alumnus from Deusto, anytime you want. Your professors and the dean have my contact details. I'm really happy to give you advice on a personal basis. Again, just be very ambitious and go and change the world.